right, good morning. My guest today is Dr. Jorg Raab, who's Associate Professor at Tilburg University. And perhaps more importantly for this discussion, he's also the Program Director, the Education Director of the Bachelor in Global Management of Social Issues. And the reason why that is relevant for today's discussion is because the program looks at organizational and policy issues in depth. And I know that because I myself studied and graduated from that program. And the program also looks at the so-called wicked problems. And these are problems that are very resistant to resolution. The first term was, the term was first used in an article in 1973 that was later developed by many scholars. And if we look at the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which is perhaps next to climate change, the biggest challenge that the world is facing today. And if we look at the Head's 2008 dimensions that he identified as far as wicked problems are concerned, so namely interdependence, uncertainty, and value divergence, to what extent would you say that the pandemic can be categorized as a wicked problem? And if so, what sort of consequences has that got as far as, you know, addressing the problem from an organizational perspective has?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Adam. That is actually a very interesting question, and I have thought a little bit about that already. I think it's quite interesting because, as such, the outbreak is not a wicked problem at all, because by now we know that it's caused by a virus. And we know what the solution is. The solution is immunity. And we can either get there through a vaccine, or we can get through what's called herd immunity. That sort of 60 to 80% of the population has gotten the disease and have built up immunity. Then the question, of course, is which way do we want to go? And some countries sort of played around with herd immunity first, but then quickly sort of abandoned that. So for the definition of the problem, that's pretty clear. So there is a definite definition of the problem, which in Riddle and Weber's original characteristic is characteristic number one, that for classical wicked problems, there is no finite definition of the problem, and that it's basically open to different perceptions and political debate. But I would say, with the exception of some fringe elements on conspiracy theories, I think 95% of the people on the planet probably would agree, okay, this disease is caused by a virus, and this is the way that we can sort of solve that problem. Now, the interesting thing is that until we get to the solution, I think it has many elements of a wicked problem. You already talked about Head and sort of the three dimensions of high uncertainty, high complexity, and value divergence. And here you see that we still do not know a lot of things. So, for example, the role of children in the transmission of the virus is still hotly debated. There are research going. But that's, of course, a crucial fact if you want to decide what to do with opening schools and daycares and these kind of decisions. We also do not quite know how the virus is transmitted. There is some knowledge. We know it's through respiratory droplets. But for example, the question to what extent actually non-symptomatic people transmitted, in what circumstances, inside, within buildings, ventilation, in airplanes. These are all very open questions. Well, compared to pandemics in the past, we know a lot more, of course, but for sort of a highly connected and interactive world, I think the amount of uncertainty is still quite considerable. And then we have to face a high complexity because I mean, the Dutch Prime Minister says we have to take decisions with 50% of the knowledge and basically drive through the mist and then see what happens. And that is also not only because of the uncertainty, but also because the decisions have so many ripple effects and interaction effects that are very hard to foresee. And just to say that on a little example, my daughters, they are in scouting, and the Dutch government has now allowed the summer camps to go through and put sort of some rules in place. But if you then think in terms of all of these little things that these 1.5 meter distance that the Netherlands is propagating this is enormously complex, just in little daily lives. And you can see that we are now only at the beginning of figuring out how to apply all these rules in practice and establishing the rules. I mean, when do we not to have to do that? Yeah? So we had a demonstration against racism in Amsterdam on June 1st that created just a lot of commotion, because there were like several thousand people coming together. And yeah, I mean, what are the rules in the future for these kind of events? Yeah, yeah. So there's enormous high complexity, I think, in all of this, with the economy, the society, psychological effects, and so on. And then we still have the value divergence. And interestingly, in the beginning, there was not much value divergence. I think most countries decided, yes, the risk to have massive deaths is too high. We basically put life above everything else, above civil rights, above economic property rights. So there was massive infringement of governments in these rights within a week, without much discussion. Nowhere in the world was there much discussion about it. But that is changing, and you already see now the discussions around the demonstrations against racism, around how do you sort of have to balance the economic damage with containing the virus. This is just starting. And as the longer this goes, the more I think we will see different perceptions where different values are prioritized. And I mean, in principle, this is not different than what we also do in other areas, right? So, for example, if you look at speed limits, yeah, so if we set 120 kilometer speed limit, we basically also say implicitly we accept a certain amount of deaths that are caused by 120. We can also decide for 80. That would probably save so many lives in a year due to the reduced speed. But we sort of accept that because we think, yeah, we want to drive 120 kilometers to save time and be faster. And these kind of discussions we will also get the longer that goes. And you can already see now in different countries that sort of these discussions will intensify. And then what, of course, the consequences might be is that we will have different perceptions of the problem. So some people will perceive it as sort of a public health threat. Some people will perceive it, yeah, this is basically a threat for people above 70. Some people will perceive it as a inconvenient sort of limitation of their personal freedom and possibilities. And yeah, I think also the discussions in parliaments, for example, will become more politicized. In the beginning, you could really see sort of everybody rallied around the government and the flag in most countries. But as this sort of continues, you will get more politicized discussions about these measures and the impact.
I think definitely politics definitely comes into play here. I mean, here in Poland, we've had the presidential election moved because of the situation, but not without a very heated and sometimes not very parliamentary debate. And now the presidential election is due to take place on 28th of June. But definitely politics, especially in Poland, that's something that we see, pretty much every single day. So definitely, I mean, even though we have a sort of a definition of the problem, and we know what we sort of know what the solution is, as in we need to find a cure. We need to, in the process, we need to impose social distancing rules and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, from an organizational perspective, this still poses several different difficulties. And there are many organizations, the WHO being perhaps the most well-known one around the world, that has been tasked with handling the issue. But we must remember that the WHO, just like the UN or the European Union, for instance, is not an authoritarian organization, right? So it's not a body that can say, you have to do this, end of story, no discussion. And that is partly where the criticism has come from. So the WHO and the UN has faced quite heavy criticism, sometimes perhaps rightly so, because certain things could have been done better. And how would you evaluate the WHO's response from this theoretical perspective, particularly if we were to take into account the ideas behind network governance and sort of coordination mechanisms?
So let me first start with going back to January and the situation there. And there actually, from an organization theory standpoint, two very interesting observations that we can make. First is around basically cognition and sense making. Mm-hmm. So I think when I read the newspaper, and I have to say here, I did not do any original research, but I sort of followed the press quite closely and also the analysis now on the actions of the WHO. It seems that to some extent, basically the health professionals all over the world and also the WHO, there was sort of a real lack of imagination that this could really happen. And I think the cognitive frame they were basically referring to was that of the SARS outbreak in 2003. And there basically transmission only happened with people that have already been quite sick. So the idea that basically asymptomatic people or people that are only mildly sick can massively spread the virus, and with the travel connections that we've had, this can go basically in days or weeks around the world. This was something that I think not many people have imagined to be possible. So if you look, for example, interviews of the Dutch public health officials, but also of Fauci in the US, which is one of the world leading public health officials. And also, if you read sort of the analysis about the WHO meetings and the the decisions whether to instate travel restrictions or not, I think that was one of the factors. And that frequently happens with organizations. There's quite some interesting research by an organizational scholar called Carl Weick about the West Nile virus outbreak in New York. And there was a similar issue that basically a veterinarian called the CDC in New York and said, I have these strange kind of sickness in animals. And the CDC said, well, we're not interested in that now. We're busy with the human outbreak. But that was the link to understand the disease. And in the end, I wonder, and I really would like to talk to some people, if you look what China did with the lockdown in Wuhan, I'm still surprised that there was no alarms going off all over the world, right? So the information that came out of China was one thing, but the thing that they did was another. And so if they locked down a 9 million inhabitant city, that should have been the signal, say, gee, what's really going on here, right? And so for a long time, we were still thinking there was no human-to-human transmission. So the cognition is one thing. The other thing is, and there is a very interesting article by a column by Thomas Friedman, New York Times columnist, about sort of the system that we have built in a globalized world. And he basically goes through 9/11, through the financial crisis, and now through the corona outbreak. And basically what he's describing is what another organizational scholar, Charles Perrow, has described as a combination of high complexity and tight coupling. And he developed that in an analysis of the 3 Mile Island disaster, atomic plant disaster in Pennsylvania in the 1970s. And basically that you have systems that are so complex with a lot of interactions that we do not grasp and do not understand, but also the interaction between the elements, between people, organizations, countries are tightly coupled. So that means what happens on one end ripples very fast through the other. The globalized air traffic system is a tightly coupled system, right? So I can go around the world, or at least I could, in 24 hours, and quite complex. I mean, you cannot really trace a disease if you do not have measures. And the somewhat disquieting analysis that Perrow came up with is that for the systems that are characterized by complex interactions and tight coupling, we do not have organizations to deal with that. And that's why he called that normal accidents. So his thesis was that atomic power plants are characterized by complex interactions and tight coupling, and that we will see accidents once in a while, and they are normal, all right, to a certain extent, because we cannot control it. Now, if you look at the globalized world, also with terms of public health, and also what Thomas Friedman, for example, described for the financial crisis, we see that the same thing. Very complex interactions between all sorts of financial transactions and financial institutions, and tight coupling, meaning if Lehman Brothers collapses, then this ripples through, in one day through the whole planet, through the whole financial system. And we saw the same thing now with the corona outbreak.
Even though at first a lot of people thought it was something regional and it was only, in China or even just in Wuhan, yeah.
Right, but that underestimated the tight coupling that we have had. And for example, Friedman also described, and I think that's true for many people, I mean, he also learned that there are so many direct flights from Wuhan that many people had never heard of, even though it's a 9 million city, but from a Western perspective, we have to admit that. Many people have never heard of that. There are, I don't know how many dozens of direct flights from Wuhan to the US every day, right? So this is sort of the tight coupling that we have created. And then it's extremely difficult to contain such an outbreak, which maybe would have been in the past. So that is the situation the World Health Organization, which is tasked sort of to react, finds itself in, right? So that already sort of puts what you can do in perspective. And then, of course, these international organizations have to face sort of a very complex governance structure. From a network perspective, they basically bring together a range of different governance modes. I mean, first they're embedded in really complex, what we call sort of serendipitous networks. So these are unplanned connections that basically result from bilateral or trilateral interactions. So the WHO is connected to a lot of scientists. It's connected to the to NGOs, to the different states, health networks, to the Gates Foundation and other foundations. So this is one part. Then, as an organization, it's characterized by self-governance, expressed by the World Health Assembly, where the states basically are members of. So the World Health Organization is on the one hand a platform where the countries of the world come together to self-govern the world themselves. Then you have an executive board and a secretariat, which sort of are more like a network administrative organization that is tasked to coordinate the whole thing. But then the WHO as an organization is also a lead organization in a network, because they have also operative personnel and run all these programs in the different countries. And if you look at the constitution, you find basically in the first sentence is directing and coordinating. And that is already quite sort of an interesting duality, which makes the thing very complex. And you can also see, if you look at how the Secretary General, Ghebreyesus, maneuvered in January and February, trying to maneuver these sort of complex structures, that is a very difficult task. And I mean, as you say, I think there were mistakes made, and I think there should be independent research to evaluate that. Because if we go into the future, I mean, we have to do much better. I mean, there's no alternative, because if you believe Perot, we can sort of reduce the complexity theoretically, but I don't see that happening. I mean, I don't see us going back to sort of reducing the travel. Once we have that under control, I don't think that people will accept that we will go back to a situation of the 1970s. I cannot believe that. So I think the only alternative we have is to try to do as best as we can in terms of improving these collaborative structures, but also seeing that we will never be able to completely control this. So there will be also normal accidents in the future.
This ties in quite well to my next question. At the moment, especially in Poland and in Hungary, you see this discussion quite often, but also in other places around the world, that this crisis and the response of the European Union, of the WHO and the UN in more general terms, has shown, critics say that has shown that the time of large international organizations, intergovernmental bodies has come to an end. And the accusation is that the European Union, the WHO, as we've said before, they've done very little in terms of practical terms to show, society, but also governments, that they have a role to play in this, and that the role of national governments and countries as an independent unit or body, so to say, is much larger, that they have a leading role here, because it is the government that imposes restrictions, for instance. In this case, it is the government that then lifts these restrictions, and so on and so forth. And when I hear that, I think to myself, partly I might not agree with this, but I can understand where they're coming from. But I see that they're missing one major aspect. The pandemic, similarly to climate change, doesn't really care about borders or boundaries, right? So it's a global situation that we are faced with. And therefore, with that in mind, with the two sides of the story, would you therefore say that in the future, when we are faced with similar crises, indeed, would you say that the role of international organizations should be larger, and they will still have a very relevant, I think relevant is the key word here, relevant role to play? Or rather, will the importance and role of governments rise further, and perhaps, in X amount of years, we might see what would be very unfortunate, the end of these intergovernmental bodies?
Well, I think you can decide to sort of go back to the 1960s and 1970s. I mean, that is a political decision. And to some extent, Brexit basically has shown that. I mean, you can take that step, but then you would also have to be prepared to take the costs, right? And for example, Poland and Ukraine had approximately the same per capita GDP in 1990. And now I think Poland is ×4 compared to Ukraine. And why is that? Yeah, because Poland opened up, they became a member of the EU, they got a lot of also financial support from the EU, and were included in a sort of division of labor production network in Europe, right? So, but with that comes a certain drawback that we see now, that you are becoming more vulnerable from external influences. That's clear. And then, of course, you have to decide what you want, because I don't think we can have this economic integration and the division of labor and sort of the comparative cost advantages without sort of this coupling and the complexity, right? That's sort of that's impossible. So of course we can sort of correct it to some extent. And you can also see the discussion now in terms of the supply chains, that we should bring something back to Europe, or the US said we want to bring some things back. But as I said before, I don't think that in the long term we will go back to a world where we can sort of everybody stays within their own nation state and that's it. So that's the economic side. There is a serious issue with regard to democratic legitimacy, and we think we should not deny that. And there's an American economist, Danny Roderick at Harvard. He basically claims that you cannot have democracy, nation states, and globalization at the same time, because if you have globalization and democracy, right, then you sort of would have to find a way to get rid of the nation states and organize democracy on a higher level, which is very difficult, right? Or you have globalization and nation states. That's sort of the Chinese model, right? So you do away with the parliaments basically, and you have executives that do the decision making, and then also the decision making in the international bodies. So I think there is a serious dilemma here, but I mean, history does not end, right? So we have to figure out things, how to deal with that. Yeah. I think the pandemic is an opportunity to sort of inflect and reflect and make things much more explicit, and think in terms of, okay, what do we want in terms of economic integration, in terms of division of labor, what makes sense, where do we have to really also internalize the costs that we now have externalized, and how can we manage this, how can we coordinate that? But in the long run, I don't think there's any alternative to international collaboration and coordination. I mean, I would not know how you do that. And I mean, given, for example, climate change, I mean, this is even much bigger than the pandemic, right? And there you need international collaboration. Otherwise, if every state basically keeps up their coal mines and keeps burning the coal for the next 20, 30 years, yeah, then we are in a world that I think nobody wants to live in. So I don't see any alternative in the end to international collaboration. The question is, how do we do that? And we have seen that many of the international organizations that we've had do not function. But the alternative, as Trump, for example, now says, well, we leave everything. Yeah, that's not the alternative. I mean, we have to discuss how we deal with this. That's I think the decisive question. And that's not only true for the international arena, the global arena, but also for Europe. So you could also see that in this time of crisis, the European Union sort of failed. But that was not necessarily the fault of the European Commission, because the nation states also did not want the European Commission or the European Union having a lot of competencies in this public health policy field. So here we also have to think how we can do that. And then, of course, leadership is also quite important. Radoslav Sikorski said in 2011, the foreign minister, Polish foreign minister then, I'm more afraid of German inactivity than of German power. Yeah, and that's what we saw in the crisis. I mean, Merkel is hailed now for the response within Germany, and there's something to be said there. But it took Germany, and from my perspective, preferably at least with France, there was no leadership whatsoever in terms of dealing with this crisis. And I can only hope that now, in dealing with the economic fallout, we'll see some of that back.
Absolutely. I think what you mentioned about the US's sort of role or position at the moment, whereby they've said that they're stopping the funding of the WHO. Earlier, they've left the Human Rights Council. We know what's happening in the WTO and the friction there between the US and China. That sort of behavior, in my opinion, is destructive from the inside, and that is probably the last thing that we need, especially in a time of crisis. So I'm glad indeed that you mentioned that. I do want to end with one sort of multi-million-dollar question, and sort of look into the future, and what, from a theoretical perspective as well, from an academic perspective, what would you say the long-term coping strategies would be with problems such as the one we are dealing with today? Because obviously some things can indeed be resolved and solved 100%, others cannot. And we need to learn how to live with certain issues, certain problems. So indeed, what sort of mechanisms would you see necessary to be imposed in the future in order to also avoid future crises such as this one?
Yeah. So if we believe the virologists and the epidemiologists, this will not be the last virus. And we have seen the last 20 years, there were quite a few. There was SARS, there was MERS, there was Zika, there was Ebola, and now Corona. So there is a pattern here. And I mean, I think it's quite reasonable that what virologists tell us, that if we push more and more into these ecosystems, that this is sort of just another accident waiting to happen. Now, I think we should stop doing that, but still, I think there is a risk that we will see another pandemic in the next 20 years. Whether it will be as badly as this, I don't know. But it has also shown that in lack of a medical response, we need to have an organizational response, and a fast one. So if you can sort of really isolate that and collaborate and basically nab an outbreak at the beginning, then that is much better than if the whole world gets infected. But in order to do that, you have to have transparency, and you have to have trust between the states, and also towards an international organization. I mean, that's imperative. So we have to build a system that enables to do that. And China reacted better than it did during the SARS outbreak, but it was not ideal, far from that. Yeah. So having said that, I think we need a World Health Organization that has much better continuous funding, less earmarked funds that can really sort of set up these warning systems and reaction systems, that countries are willing to current data, and also act collaboratively and fast if another situation will occur. But I'm afraid that an international organization cannot do that on their own. So I think there's no alternative to basically, I would say, China, the EU, and the US finding an agreement in the future to sort of take the leadership in supporting that organization. I mean, if you have sort of strategic battles and political battles during an outbreak, yeah, that is detrimental. And I hope that with the new government in the US will see that basically it made the right decision, and sort of coming back to Churchill's quote, the US does the right thing after they have exhausted all the wrong options. Also here you see that isolationism doesn't work, because the virus will eventually get to your country, so you have to stay engaged. And you, as a country like the US, you have to take at least a co-leadership with China and the EU in building a system that can create a governance form that is not perfect, but much better than what we have now.
I would definitely agree, and I think I would add also exchange of information. So a more transparent but also trustworthy stream of exchange of information between different units and bodies, because I think that is something that at the very beginning of this particular crisis resulted in bigger detrimental effects than it could have if the exchange of information was better, right? Because I think that's what we saw between China and WHO, and it's also what you mentioned at the beginning. So saying is one thing, but also looking at what China does and did in terms of locking down Wuhan, that should have also raised alarm bells. All right, well, thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure, and I'm sure that there are quite a few critical points mentioned here that will definitely serve useful to the audience watching us. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.